service and The World Tonight on Radio 4. But before he stepped into the radio studio, he was Middle East correspondent of The Observer. He has a Substack, not because who doesn't have a Substack, but because he still has plenty to say. Free at the point of consumption, most of the time.
Yeah, by choice. There is also a payment option.
Yes, okay. And then
notice that.
And then Jonathan Rugman, who's a longtime foreign correspondent for Channel 4 News. And before that, he was the Turkey correspondent for the BBC and The Guardian. He's the author of 2 books set in Turkey. The latest is Killing in the Consulate, which tells the story of the murder of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi in Istanbul in 2018. So thank you all for joining me in this exploration of why. And I thought, to begin with, just a quick round robin. Am I over-egging things, or does the kind of democracy that we grew up with, have reported on, has it undergone a sea change? Robin?
Yeah. You want me to start?
Go ahead.
I came across a quote from that well-known Democrat, Joseph Goebbels, which may be apocryphal, I don't know, but it's been quoted in reputable publications. And he's reputed to have said that one of the best jokes of democracy has always been that it gives its deadly enemies the means by which to destroy it. And it is a kind of intrinsic paradox of democracy that you do give people the chance to vote for anti-democrats. And what it seems to me democracy has never worked out, and your Algerian example is a very good example of that, more recently Romania, where it didn't work. Democracy has never worked out what to do in those circumstances. I've just been in the US, as it happens, where, as you will know, the discussion is all about how the anti-Trump forces should react to the gallop authoritarianism that they're experiencing. I wrote a piece a couple of months ago saying that there are 2 ways to destroy democracy, the quick way and the slow way. And it seemed to me that Israel and Turkey were both very good examples of the slow way, and America was a very good example of the quick way. But they're all doing it by using the same means. So yeah, I think you're right. We are watching something that we're not familiar with, and we've not worked out what to do about it.
Jonathan?
Yeah, I mean, I think those of us following Turkey made a bit of a mistake when Erdogan first came to power, because in the 1990s, he emerged from being the mayor of Istanbul to going to jail, ironically, given that his main opposition leader is now in jail. But he went to jail accused of fomenting Islamic extremism. And if you talk to, secular Turks in Istanbul, the big fear about Turkey was that it was going to become an Islamic state. And we were wrong about that. That wasn't the threat that Erdogan posed, although certainly Turkey is much more overtly Islamic than it was. What turned out to be the problem was power itself and Erdogan, and that age-old story of a very popular leader starts off doing all the right things, removes the death penalty, cozies up to the Kurds, makes friends with the Greeks, the EU in general, and then the power goes to his head and he can't resist staying and staying. L'état c'est moi. If you listen to the interview Nick Robinson did with Joe Biden the other day, Joe Biden made that little slip where he said when Nick Robinson said, well, why didn't you step aside earlier to let somebody else run? And he said, well, I just couldn't let go. And it's that thing. And Erdogan is a massively obvious example of that. You see it all over the world. It's not new. I think of people like Musharraf in Pakistan. The really sad thing about Turkey is it's not a million miles from here. Millions of us go on holiday there. We know about Turkey, and the rule of law is gone. I mean, it is as absolute as that. And although the story has slipped from the headlines since March, when the mayor was locked up, it's over, actually, which is a very shocking thing to say. It's the most significant moment for Turkish democracy since the 1980 military coup, which is saying something.
We'll come back to this for more details. But Stephanie, you're in a unique position because you're an American-born, although you've lived abroad a long time. You spent a tremendous amount of time in Russia. And, of course, in America, there's this way of thinking that much of the problems in our democracy somehow get traced back to nefarious, underhanded doings emanating from the FSB and the man in charge. Do you think that that's accurate? And or are America's democratic problems American origin rather than, agitation from abroad?
Well, I think there's no doubt that the Russian intelligence agencies have tried through various means, which we've seen documented at 2016, more recent election, to interfere in the US elections. I have spent an inordinate amount of time trying to research whether or not Trump is really a Russian asset. And I've concluded that it doesn't really matter. I've talked to a lot of people who say that they've got evidence that yes, he was, but not anything that's reportable. But I don't think it matters anymore, because I think that the fundamental issue is that Trump admires Putin as a strongman leader. And there is a strain of the American right, MAGA right, that admires what Putin is doing because they believe that he is advancing Christian values, anti-woke policies, anti-LGBTQ policies, and that is the kind of model of what they want for the US. So the degree to which you can attribute that to a Russian hybrid operation, I think is impossible to say. What I have been thinking a lot of recently is, having spent the past 30 years, my entire adult life, studying the Russian oligarchy. I moved to Prague in 1990, watched the birth of democracy in all these East European countries. Slovakia, where Fico now is, I think he's in Moscow today, actually, with Putin. Orban, who I used to work with, Fidesz, young Fidesz activists back then. It's sort of unthinkable that we would be in this space, that you'd have East European countries that had fought so hard for democratic values to have such an incredible reversal. And what's happening, I think, in the US is so similar to the rise of the oligarchy in Russia. The parallels are sort of uncanny. I mean, obviously, Russia's oligarchy arose because of the very unique conditions of the privatization process in Russia in the 1990s, the loans for shares, where a clutch of billionaires, emerging tycoons, got assets on the cheap by loaning money to the bankrupt Yeltsin government, and that was sort of Russia's original sin. And Russia power. I don't think in the U.S., obviously it's very different. It's not the same, but you do have an emerging oligarchy that are paying fealty to Trump, and I think that the risk is they don't realize that, they're saying that they're doing it to protect their shareholder value and the like, but in reality, what they're doing is sowing the seeds of their own destruction, because I think what all of Trump's policies, whether it's deportations, tariffs, dismantling the state, is going to just encourage a level of corruption that will actually unravel what had been a very successful U.S. economy.
That is from up on high. I wonder if we could all think about what it is, what's in it for ordinary people, that they endorse the kinds of politicians that oversee, economic policies that empower to the degree that Silicon Valley has been empowered, primed. I mean, talk about pump priming. Everything comes from the federal government ultimately in terms of research and development that is then allowed to be spun off into shares and private companies. And I let me just ask Jonathan to go back. The mayor of Istanbul back in March was arrested, coming up through the same basically channel that Erdogan did, as mayor of this mega city, a country in and of itself. There were riots, but it's all gone quiet. Do you think, does the ordinary Turkish citizen sort of say, well, that's them in Istanbul, and I'm quite...
No, actually, it hasn't gone quiet. I think we've just not been reporting it. So there are protests, regional protests across Turkey, including in areas that you would think would be loyal to Erdogan. It's reckoned that it's cost the Turkish government about $100 billion to prop up the Turkish lira, which has been devalued. So who's going to invest? If there's no rule of law, if the courts are no longer impartial, if the guy who was most likely to become the next president, were there to be a free and fair election, is now in jail. So this is a country where an enormous amount is going on, and the only avenue for Turkish police car.
Coming for you.
Coming through the back door there.
What happens is that when the democratic norms of a country get shut down, all you've got left is the street. And that's what's happening in Turkey. And for me, the rather shocking comparison is with the Arab Spring. I mean, whoever thought you'd compare Turkey with its former colonial subjects, which had their own revolutions, as we know, in 2011. But it's not playing out like that, like those did. So, we remember the revolution in Egypt, and there was all those people out in Tahrir Square. And we sort of waited, and one leader was toppled in Tunisia, then we went to Egypt, and then we went to Libya, and apart from Syria and Yemen, I suppose, there was a sort of feeling of a kind of domino effect. And I guess people were thinking in March, well, is this going to go the same way? All these people are on the street. Is this the media likes a kind of neat story, a bit like the crowds in St. Peter's Square waiting for the Pope. Lots of people on the streets of Istanbul. Does the leader buckle? No, he doesn't. He's still, it hasn't kind of conformed to a kind of pattern. And it's a very long, drawn-out process, which has slipped from the media, but precisely because the media isn't very good at dealing with processes. It's good at dealing with events.
But also, it does help. It's quite a preemptive strike. He didn't have to call an election until 2028, and he arrested the guy in 2025.
He did have to do it. And some people are saying, oh, that's because Trump gave him carte blanche to do it, and he knew he could get away with it. And actually, I think autocracies have their own arcs of, and Erdogan was dreaming of absolute power when Donald Trump was in short trousers. In other words, this has been going on a long time. And the deadline for Erdogan was that Ekrem İmamoğlu was about to be registered as the opposition's official candidate in that week that he was arrested. So that's why he was arrested. He stays in jail. Erdogan can't afford to step down. All he can do is wait. He's trying to change the constitution. That's the next step, I think, whereby if he changes it, he can run into 2028. The problem he has is that if he has a referendum on changing the constitution, he'd lose it, precisely because of what's going on in Istanbul. So the only other way he can do it is by going through Parliament, and the only way he can get it through Parliament is by buying off the Kurds. And so you may have remember that news story about the PKK giving up its armed struggle. That may be part of a much bigger choreographed process of events whereby the Kurds get given some constitutional guarantees about their ethnic identity that they don't currently have, in exchange for supporting Erdogan changing the constitution to keep himself in power. So it's a very murky story, and those protests are continuing. They're just not making headlines.
Right. I just wanted to add a thought. You raised the Arab uprisings of 2011, and I remember going to Istanbul in late 2011, where there was a conference of Arab democracy activists who wanted to see whether Turkey was an example they could follow of a Muslim majority nation operating under democratic norms.
Yeah.
And it was a very interesting occasion, but all of the Turkish democracy activists that I spoke to went, no, this isn't a democracy. Even then, they could see that Erdogan was not a democratic leader. There's this famous quote of his, isn't there, going all the way back to when he was mayor of Istanbul: democracy is like a tram. You get on it, and when you reach your destination, you get off. And they had already sussed that then. But there was a feeling in many Arab nations, I think, that perhaps at that point, Turkey might have been an example of a Muslim majority nation which could embrace both its Islam and democracy.
That's absolutely right. I mean, the first Muslim country that Barack Obama went to when he was elected was Turkey.
Yes.
Where's Donald Trump going next week? Saudi Arabia. I mean, so when Obama went to Turkey, he did so because he thought this was a really important place where democracy and Islam can coexist, and this was something that needed to be encouraged and promoted. And as you know, the White House logs calls between the president and world leaders. And if you look at 2011, the year of the Arab Spring, the most calls that Obama made were with David Cameron. The second leader, the most calls, Erdogan. And now we're in a situation in some ways similar in that everybody realizes how important Erdogan is, and that's why the international criticism has been quite muted, playing a mediating role in Ukraine. He's behind the new government in Syria. He's preventing millions of refugees from the Arab world from reaching Europe as they did in 2015. And that, of course, is muting a lot of the criticism.
I mean, we're in the Turkey segment here, I guess. But I mean, that also goes to the fact that Turkey is the southern flank of NATO, which is going through its own crisis at the moment, inspired by, Trump's presidency. And he just seems to have been very shrewd in knowing how to play that very strong card. I mean, Erdogan has, of being, and
The gatekeeper, yeah.
my first encounter with the whole situation was in 2003, in February 2003, when he had been elected prime minister but couldn't take office yet because he'd been in prison. And the law there was in Turkey was that if you've done prison time, you can't serve in national leadership there was a cordon sanitaire on that. So he wasn't actually yet in office, although he'd been elected. And they refused to let the US launch a northern assault on Iraq in 2003, which was certainly pleased the nationalists in Turkey. And they couldn't throw him out of NATO because they still need Incirlik and all of the NATO bases. So he's been very good at that. And perhaps that too has gone to his head a bit. But that dynamic hasn't changed, really. When you speak of his importance to whatever quiet diplomacy is going on with Ukraine that allows grain to come out of Ukraine and get safely across the Black Sea, down the Bosporus.
And in terms of the UK, I think a long time ago, the Brits worked out that there was another Bolshevik country of about the same size that had suspicious attitudes towards Europe that they could trade with, and Turkey is a G20 economy. And I think the Brits have tried harder than anybody else to be the Turks' best friend in Europe. So the first government minister to go out to seat Erdogan after the 2016 attempted coup against him was a British government minister, Alan Duncan. And we're now in a situation where the Turks are trying to build a stealth fighter jet in conjunction with BAE Systems. And you've got Rolls-Royce engines selling lots of engines to aircraft engines to the Turks. So I think we don't hear much about that, but I think that explains quite a lot of the silence as to what's going on.
I want to, earlier you were just talking about courts. It's assault on courts, I think, that is a theme, and increasingly in America as well. What alerted the world to Netanyahu prior to October 7th, in that year when he was in office. The last election was 2022 in Israel. He immediately was trying to take over the judiciary and dismiss the Attorney General, and because they too have a constitution which doesn't fit in your pocket. They don't have a constitution essentially in Israel, and it's just handling. And Robin, do you want to talk? I mean, this is the thing that underpins the rule of law, is the courts.
I made a series of documentaries many years ago for the BBC about different kinds of democracy around the world. And one of the things that came through to me very clearly was that it's a cardinal error to think that elections equal democracy. Of course you need elections, but you also need an independent and robust judiciary, and you also need a free press. And once you start chipping away at either of those two things, it really doesn't matter whether you continue to have the elections, even if they're relatively free and fair elections in which you allow opposition candidates to run. If you don't have an independent and robust judiciary, and if you don't have a free press, you're not really entitled to call yourself a democracy. And one of the things that's interesting about the kinds of countries that we're discussing tonight is that they're all really following the same template, because authoritarian leaders all understand this very well. If you can weaken the judiciary, if you can weaken the free press, you are much more likely to be able to rule as an authoritarian with the support of sufficient numbers of voters to continue in power with elections every so often. I mean, one of the things I think that we don't discuss enough is why people vote for authoritarians, knowing that they are authoritarians and possibly even anti-democrats. And if you look back over the last 20, 25 years, it is possible to argue that traditional forms of liberal democracy have not delivered for everybody in their relative communities. And so when you say to somebody in a deindustrialized community that there are no simple answers to complex problems, they will answer, well, the people we've been voting for the last 10 years haven't come up with any answers either. We've had recessions, we've had the banking crash, we've had, in a different form, but nevertheless, we've had a COVID pandemic, which governments didn't know how to react with. So let's give a different kind of leader a chance. Let's give Nigel Farage or Donald Trump or Viktor Orban or whoever it might be a chance. And we don't really mind about all these judges. You remember that Daily Mail headline some years ago, enemies of the people?
Yeah.
And Trump is now saying exactly the same thing about, what's it, radical left lunatic judges.
But there's a great Achilles heel to all of this if you're an autocrat, which is once you've done what you've just said and you've taken over the courts. Mm-hmm. So the average legal experience of a judge in Turkey is about 4 years being a lawyer, because they're all new, they've all been imported, and they've sacked all the other judges. So once you've taken over the courts, Erdogan controls 90% of the media. The protests in Istanbul are therefore not shown on the main channels. But nevertheless, the problem you have is if you say it's all about me, then if things don't go well, it's still all about you. And that's the problem Trump is facing at the moment already. So he's desperate for a peace deal somewhere, anywhere, Ukraine, Gaza, Iran, because he needs a win, precisely because he's just told everybody that he is responsible for success, for everything America does.
And therefore also responsible for failure.
Exactly. So you talk to a taxi driver in Istanbul and the economy's, inflation is 37% this month. Who are they going to blame? They're going to blame the guy who said he was the savior. And that's the problem that every autocrat eventually faces.
But I mean,
Except in Russia, right,
coming
Stephanie?
specifically to Israel, you want to just, I mean, very briefly, Netanyahu understands that he's got to emasculate the judiciary because the Supreme Court have tried to prevent him doing some of the things he wanted to do. So the Knesset has now eventually passed legislation which changes the composition of the body that appoints Supreme Court judges to increase the political influence so he can influence that more. He has succeeded in firing the head of Shin Bet, the Internal Security Agency. He's fired his Attorney General. He is, in effect, emasculating the judiciary, which, of course, means he has more power, more unfettered power.
I mean, I think obviously the judiciary is absolutely crucial, and it's something I've seen firsthand in Russia. It's been probably one of the central problems facing Russia is that even 25 years ago, when Putin was starting out, the efforts to reform the Russian judicial system were very slow, and it's been a constant source of bribery. There is no rule of law in Russia. There is no contract that you can rely on. Your enemies will buy judges and move a case, to a far-flung district and have it fought out there. I think in the U.S., what's really interesting to me is that I think the judicial system in the U.S. has been very strong, right? I mean, it's one of the great strengths of the U.S. is the rule of law, and I think it's one of the things that has attracted so much investment into the U.S. But the judicial system didn't handle Trump 1 very well. I mean, January 6th, he was not impeached or prosecuted. The transfer of the documents to Mar-a-Lago, that also failed. I do think, though, this time around, the judiciary is probably the best hope we've got because, yes, I think we are already in a constitutional crisis in the U.S. because he has defied, federal judges and their orders. I mean, there was the federal judge in February that told him to turn the plane around, the plane full of Venezuelan immigrants to El Salvador, turn it around, and he defied that. But I think it was a week ago, there was a Texas judge appointed by Trump that ruled he could not use this 18th century Alien Enemies Act as the basis to deport people. And I think that was very significant. And 2/3 of federal judges, if I'm correct, have been appointed by either Obama or Biden. But you even have Trump appointed judges that are trying to draw a line, and even the likes of Amy Coney Barrett, who I thought would actually be worse, seems to be is challenging some of these Trump decisions in a way that I would have not thought originally.
It's
In Wisconsin, we just saw the FBI arrest a judge, and if that is repeated, that becomes really very, very dangerous.
I agree, and I think this is the strength of the U.S. system is obviously the federal nature of it, and that you do have rights of appeal, and I think you do have counteractions that will. I'm not sure what happened with that case in the end, but
she's been arrested, and they have 2 weeks.
she's out.
They have
She's
2
out.
weeks to formulate an indictment of some
right, she's
kind.
not in jail.
No.
Right. So I mean, there is a legal process that is going to play out.
So she's
But it does seem to me that one of the most effective weapons that any authoritarian leader has is the installation of fear. And what you've certainly seen, for example, in the Israeli press, and I think you've seen it in parts of the American judicial system, is fear of going against the government.
And one of the biggest problems in the U.S. has been Trump's assault on law firms,
Absolutely.
which I think is feeding into that.
And universities.
And then it means that, I think the corporatization of these big white shoe law firms, whereby their main client base are now corporations and private equity who are beholden to Trump and his decision making, I think is really crucial here, because they will not take on clients that are being targeted by Trump for fear of retribution again. And you saw just recently there's one of the lawyers is forming a law firm specifically to take on clients who have been targeted by the Trump administration, which I think is a really significant step, because I think there is an issue about people getting representation with some of these cases. I mean, he's weaponized the the legal system in a way that we've never seen before.
It's interesting. I want to take it, because it's so vast, the U.S. We have the federal courts, but there are state courts, individual, and this goes back to, yes, it's important to have the rule of law. Part of the rule of law is acknowledging the validity of elections. And in North Carolina, the state Supreme Court is elected, which sounds odd, and don't ask me about the details of it, but there was a seat up last November on the Supreme Court, and the incumbent was a Democrat. And she held the seat in the elections on November 5th and was immediately challenged by her Republican opponent, who just burned through God knows how much money and legal fees, challenging over and over again. And it was only yesterday that he finally acknowledged, yes, you did win by however many, 60,000 votes. But if you have the money, you can challenge virtually any election now in America. And that is a problem, I think, that we don't talk enough about, which is, it's a particular one. I mean, Trump broke the taboo on that. You can just say, no, I didn't lose this election, and I don't acknowledge it. And in his case, he sent the monkeys on broomsticks up the hill to assault Oz or whatever, and they destroyed the Capitol.
So, and what you're seeing, I think, in the U.S. is people not responding to these issues about rule of law and violation of due process rights. And I think part of it is the way it's being articulated by the Democrats. They're not making people understand the connection between that and their everyday lives. I'm somewhat optimistic, because I think what Trump is doing is actually, it's happening at such warp speed. The state capture of institutions, Elon Musk going in and actually taking control of government computers and passwords and data, the tariffs, which will have such a massive and very quick economic impact, that I'm hopeful that the midterm elections will be, a landslide for the Democrats. But what you're saying is, I think there in the next year there are real challenges to free and fair elections.
But my question is how much difference that kind of midterm election result would make, given that Trump seems to have found a way to rule by ignoring Congress, by just issuing a never-ending stream of executive orders, and the court system being as slow as it is. Even though hundreds of these orders are being challenged, he seems to be able to do pretty much what he likes, and without Congress at all.
Well, I think it depends on the level of the majority, right? I mean, there were attempts to challenge his use of IEPA, which is this International Emergency Powers Act, which is the act that was used to enact sanctions against Russia, but he's now using it to declare an emergency, which is baseless, to enact all these tariffs. I mean, I do think that if there's a big enough majority, I mean, the House has been a real problem because it's so captured by the Republicans that if there is a Democratic majority in both the Senate and the House, that there could be at least more of a challenge to what he's doing.
Inshallah, as they say in the Arab world.
What?
Inshallah.
Inshallah, better hope they don't listen to this at the NSA. But just to carry on, Jonathan mentioned fear. And, fear is something that is hard for people to acknowledge, that they start to change their behavior. Yeah, it's great that people come out in Gezi Square or wherever they are gathering in Istanbul. and every weekend you can find demonstrations this far and no further, because fear, say, well, you can come out, we don't care. I mean, these authoritarian Democrats, it's priced into what they're trying to do. No one is too worried. How have you observed fear working, say, outside of America? And then we can come back to talking about fear in America.
Well, I would say that the arrest and detention of the mayor of Istanbul was an act of fear by Erdogan. I mean, he's frightened. He's frightened enough of the guy to have him locked up, as you said, 3 years before there was an election in which, in theory, Erdogan doesn't have the right to stand. So I think fear cuts both ways, and I think what happened in the Arab Spring was people overcame their fear and they were prepared to be shot at and killed. And once they'd crossed that Rubicon, the fear imposed by the regime began to dissipate. But you're right, in Turkey, there's this kind of rolling series of protests that just pushes as far as it dare go. And there's the memory of the protests over the Gezi Park, which erupted in 2013. It was very brutally clamped down on, and there've been a lot of arrests in the last, thousands of arrests in the last couple of months. So yeah, so Erdogan's fear is currently winning, but he's so frightened that he can't leave power. He can't afford to. He's too corrupt. If you're a despot who's packed the courts with your supporters, you know that the next guy could pack the courts with his supporters and have you imprisoned. So you've got these both sides rather locked into this situation where the protesters can only protest. They can't go down any other democratic avenue because they don't exist. And Erdogan can only stay. And I think that's obviously a common dynamic with autocrats.
Yeah, it's interesting because that's been the take on Netanyahu for 2 years now. Again, going back to before October 7th, that he can't leave office because they've got him dead to rights on all manner of corruption charges. And there's a very good chance that he might end up in jail, although I always worry about that. You know, when some people are above the law, some people are.
Ehud Olmert ended up in jail.
Who?
Ehud Olmert, a previously corrupt Israeli prime minister.
And he's a star on Channel 4 News.
I know. Yeah.
He's the only one who speaks truth about what's going on in Gaza from an Israeli.
Read you a quote from an Israeli magazine. I talked about freedom of the press as being one of the kind of cardinal pillars on which democracies reside. Two things. The Committee to Protect Journalists estimate that at least 176 journalists and media workers have been killed in Gaza, the West Bank, Lebanon, and Israel since October 7, 2023. And a magazine called Plus 972, which is a very brave Israeli magazine, said this about the way in which the media now reacts to what's happening in Israel. Instead of bearing witness to the truth of the war or amplifying the voices of Gaza-based journalists, let alone showing solidarity with colleagues targeted by their state's army, most Israeli journalists have enlisted in the war propaganda effort to the point of joining combat troops and actively participating in demolishing buildings and freely platform direct calls for genocide, starvation, and other war crimes. This isn't coercion, it's complicity. The censor didn't erase Gaza's horrors from Israeli screens, the journalists and editors did. So what Netanyahu has managed to do is instill a culture in the Israeli media of, well, in the words of this magazine, of complicity. And that is born in part, at least, out of fear of professional not being able to continue in your job. It is a fact, I believe, that Israelis see virtually nothing of what is actually happening on the ground in Gaza because it simply isn't reported on television screens. And one of the crimes with which Netanyahu has been charged is of offering, offering favorable treatment to one media outlet in return for favorable coverage, so suborning the press in his own favor. And that's a very dangerous part of the weakening of any democratic structure. Israel has always prided itself supposedly on being the only democratic state in the Middle East. It's never been that much of a democracy, but it's surely much less of one now.
Although historically, long before this, I mean, offshore American billionaires were funding pro-Netanyahu news websites and television stations. So this, what's the phrase, astroturfing of Israeli public opinion has been going on for 15 years with the help of offshore billionaires, starting channel 12, 13, 14, whatever.
I mean, here's one other thing that people might not know about Israeli media. There is military censorship in Israel. There's always been military censorship in Israel. When I was a correspondent there, one of the first things I had to do in order to get my accreditation was sign an undertaking that I would, even as a foreign correspondent, abide by military censorship, which in effect meant that if you wrote anything which had security implications, you had to submit it to the censor first. This magazine, Plus 972, did a Freedom of Information request to ask how many instances there had been of censorship since the outbreak of the war in Gaza. Over the course of last year, 2024, the censor completely banned the publication of 1,635 articles and partially censored another 6,265. On average, the censor intervened in about 21 news reports per day. And one of the ways in which the system works is you're not allowed to say that your report has been censored. So the Israeli public don't know that. And I mean, if I can just tell one story from my time in Israel, which is going back a long way, some people here might remember when the Sunday Times reported the claims of an Israeli whistleblower called Mordechai Vanunu, who had been a worker at the Dimona nuclear weapons plant. I was the Observer correspondent, so I was rather badly wrong-footed by this Sunday Times global exclusive. I did my best to follow it up, and knowing how neuralgic Israel was about anything to do with its nuclear weapons program, I did indeed submit it to the military censor. And every paragraph was excised except the ones repeating what the Sunday Times had reported the previous week.
Incredible. I mean, obviously Russia is an extreme case where there is absolutely no freedom of the press, and Putin has such a tight grip on state media, which is, spouting out, rabid rhetoric, threatening to nuke London to the extreme. When I was reporting this book, I did not feel safe enough to go to Russia. I actually hired a Russian reporter. It took me a long time to find someone I could rely on. And he has since been forced to leave Russia because his mother was put in jail for 5 years. She's a journalist as well, for just a tweet, something she'd shared on social media like 5 years ago. And she's now sitting in a Russian jail, which gives you a sense of, how he is able to keep control of the messaging. And I think that's, another, I wanted to pick up on what you said. It's one of the reasons why, a lot of people thought, oh, well, we're going to sanction Russia and, people are going to be so upset that they're going to stage a coup. Putin's not leaving unless he probably dies or there is a coup and he's shot, because he's stolen far too much money to be able to go out. Even in a sort of the way Yeltsin went out, Putin did a deal that basically they wouldn't go after Yeltsin and his family for any kind of corruption that happened in the 90s. I don't even think that deal is possible for Putin. He's going to cling on for as long as he possibly can, and it will be an ignominious end.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the U.S. is another example of challenges to media freedom that I never thought I would see. I of course have lived and reported on Russian oligarchs in London with the threat of a libel case, and lawyers' letters coming at me fast and furious. But the use of defamation in the U.S. is kind of unprecedented. Of course, ABC settled the case that that Trump brought against George Stephanopoulos, which I think most lawyers think he could have won, but did not want to challenge because of the corporate structure of media holdings. And it looks like CBS is about to settle this lawsuit over the 60 Minutes, the way they edited the interview with Kamala Harris, which is a terrifying prospect that you could get sued for that. And again, it's because of corporate ownership of CBS. The parent company Paramount has a deal that they're hoping to get through. And Trump has said very clearly that he is taking control of the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, and the Federal Trade Commission, which means that if you want to do a deal in the U.S., it has to go through Trump. It's been completely politicized, which filters down through the courts, the media, and far beyond.
What interests me, and I find it really hard to take, is that if in theory, I mean, you mentioned the midterms, Stephanie, and as the weeks go by, I think a lot of people are realizing that even though it's a ways away, that is what people are going to end up focused on, a democratic return of control of at least the House of Representatives. I mean, you should be able to say, we've all spent, I'm American, you're American, we've all spent time in America, should be able to say, well, you know what, you do what you want, because you'll be gone. And if you want to do all of this radical stuff,
or illegal stuff,
we can undo it.
With the statute of limitations hanging over you.
We can undo this the day you leave office. And you might want to tell Don Jr. and Eric not to spend their inheritance yet, because we're gonna get all your money. That's it. People don't act that way. That's the thing that makes me nervous sitting over here, is that people seem not to think, well, he'll be gone. He's obviously old. He may not make it to 2028 anyway. But we don't feel that, do we?
Well, yeah, I mean, Erdogan's 71. He's already survived a bout of cancer. One of the ways out for an autocrat is, of course, to groom your son and heir. And in that sense, Turkey's looking more like a Central Asian country than the traditional bridge between East and West. It's sort of got off the bridge and decided to go in one direction. So Erdogan has a son called Bilal. He has two son-in-laws, one of whom is a guy called Bayraktar. He's the guy who makes the drones that the Turks give the Ukrainians, while not sanctioning the Russians, in that classic sort of Turkey trying to be a member of NATO and yet non-aligned at the same time. So maybe that's a way out for Erdogan, that he escapes prosecution. He either dies in office, like Putin, or he passes it on to a relative.
Didn't Putin say the other day that he thinks every day about the succession issue? I saw a quote.
I mean, I'm sure I think he wishes he had sons that he could groom, and he has two daughters that aren't. He has younger sons that are from his mistress that are not of age to take over, but who knows how long he'll last.
He doesn't have a succession plan, does he?
No, nothing.
No. Did Stalin have a succession plan? No.
No, I mean, I think this is the thing with Russia. It will come fast and sudden and very unexpected, and it's very uncertain. I think there's a wrong assumption that if Putin goes, someone better will take over, and it's very possible someone much worse could take over.
This is my thought. Every time I spend far too much time on social media. Hands up, people who think they spend too much time on social media. It's a safe space. Say yes or no. Right? So all day long on social media, you see people, talking about, oh, Trump's, demented. He's got to go. 25th Amendment, which allows you to be removed from office for reasons of physical decrepitude, mental decrepitude. I think, but then you get J.D. Vance, backed by Peter Thiel. Be careful of what you wish for. This might be better to just, buckle up and go and ride it out. But I do want to just say that in 2016, 2017, in one of the early editions of my podcast, FRDH podcast, I had a bunch of people from Dateline London whose origins were in the Middle East, Mustafa Kuti and Syrian and Iranian and someone from Abu Dhabi. And Mina al-Oraibi said, but they're going to love him in the Middle East because he does business just the way they do. It's all with the sons. He won't send an ambassador to say, you have to improve your human rights record, which is what everybody did, right?
Which is why Trump, May 2016, what's the first country he visits? Saudi Arabia.
Exactly.
Where's he going next week? Saudi
Arabia.
If you look at the speech Trump made when he was announcing he was running for president in 2016, it was in Trump Tower. Very long, rambling speech. And in the middle of it, he said, I love the Saudis. They buy apartments from me.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you're right. There is that massive respect for an unelected, absolute dynastic power that he feels he can do business with. And as you said, made a very conscious choice when he went to Saudi Arabia last time. He said, we're not here to lecture you on human rights. Very much differentiating himself from what had gone before.
It was notable after Trump won, when all of his former aides wrote their instant memoirs, how many of them made a point of saying he was not a Democrat, that instinctively in his inner core, he didn't have a democratic moral fiber.
He didn't, and he proved it on January 6th.
Absolutely.
And 49% of the electorate went for him. And it was only a fraction, convinced it was only a fraction of misogyny and racism that turned the electorate away from Kamala Harris. I think something has happened in the American body politic that they can look at Trump and say, well, that's all right. I'd have done the same thing in issues. I wouldn't admit that I lost.
I
And that's
certainly think
worrisome.
that all the world's authoritarian leaders have watched The Godfather and have regarded that as a template for how to exercise power, because it is the power of intimidation and of threats and the belief that if you exert power or if you give the impression of possessing power, that is enough for you to get your own way. There was quite an interesting piece in the FT a few weeks ago by Yuval Noah Harari, the Israeli writer, who said that the way to understand Trump's worldview is to think of him as somebody who divides the world into strong powers and weak powers. And the role of weak powers is to do what strong powers tell them to do. And if they don't, then it's their fault if bad things happen to them. He obviously thinks of the US as a strong power. He thinks of Russia and China and Turkey and Israel as strong powers. They're all on the same side. And it is their right to mold the world in the way that suits them best. And it's the complete antithesis of the democratic vision.
I think there's this assumption, though, as well, that okay, well, Trump may be out in 4 years, the Democrats may come in 2 years and take control of Congress, but the extent to what they're doing is going to be very hard to rectify if there is a change. And I think that is what is people aren't talking about enough, that the dismantling of the institutions, and they're only just getting started, right? We're only 100 days in. Yeah. They haven't even really started to get into Social Security. And once they start dismantling that, that's not easy to put back together. But the positive of that is I think people will react. There will be a visceral reaction to that, because you're hitting people in their pocketbooks. I mean, where it really will hurt, and that is, use the overused phrase, it's the economy stupid. I think it will have a political impact, because he is assaulting the U.S. economy in such a sort of profound way.
But I mean, you touched on something that what you do in your time as an autocrat lasts long beyond. I mean,
Yes.
there are a lot of things that Trump has done that will not come back. And similarly in Turkey, if you've had 22 years now of Erdogan, you know, you've completely infected the body politic. You know, the system as it was has been destroyed from within. And what you do when the economy goes badly is you play the culture wars.
Yeah.
So in Erdogan's case, LGBT issues, nationalism, talking about terrorism, talking about the threat from the Kurds, all that increases at the point where the economy is, you know, so James Carville, it's the economy, stupid, no longer applies. If you're Trump as well, you start playing a different
I
game.
think that's sort of where we've got to in America.
Yeah.
It is no longer the economy, stupid. I mean, yes, I thought it is a political thing, and then we're coming to you for questions. Promise. Just to say that when last June I was, I went driving along the border because the border was supposed to be a big issue. It wasn't a big issue. Believe me, it wasn't. The border is pretty calm, except in El Paso and down in Laredo. Otherwise, there's no hassle. I was shocked. I went shopping to get food, you know, staying in a Motel 6. I was on a low budget, BBC budget. I mean, I couldn't walk out of a shop with, you know, a couple of deli items for my dinner for under $20. And that's not possible. You know, it's just, and they ran away from it. However, I still think that it was the Democrats' denial that it was a problem, rather than the economy. Stupid people have jobs. But if your leadership says, well, no, we've got the best GDP growth in the entire world after COVID, it means nothing when you go to buy groceries for your family.
But if you campaign on cutting costs and you end up spiking costs by imposing unprecedented tariffs, I think that's going to come back to bite him.
In November of 2026, if we're all still alive. Listen, have we got the microphone ready? Hello? Where'd they go? He went downstairs. Okay, is it working? I can't hear you.
Hello?
Now I can hear you.
Yeah.
Anybody have a question? Okay, down here, and then we'll get to you, Mary.
It's a very easy, simple question. You all mentioned, I hope there's midterm elections, but you're on the internet a lot, I see you. They're all talking about, he declared this military parade on his birthday and the 200th anniversary, but then Occupy Democrat, everybody's saying there's going to be a counter march and there could be some kind of conflict, and that will give him the excuse to declare, what do you call it, supreme powers, extreme powers,
Martial
and
law.
that could, martial law. So how credible is that, do people think?
I think that the benefit of the U.S. system is that elections are really controlled by local officials. So I think that there will be a lot of pushback, not to say that there won't be some kind of challenge like that, but if he, was that?
This is supposed to happen in June. Next month is
An
supposed to be
event that leads
stuff
to the
in the
declaration
streets,
of
like
martial
violence
law.
in the streets,
Right,
and he's
okay.
going to declare martial law.
Well, I think that will be very much, we'll be in an undeniable constitutional crisis at that point, I think. I thought you were talking about if he declares martial law to try to prevent the midterm elections. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think there'll be huge opposition to that. Well, you know, I think that will throw the U.S. into a full-blown constitutional crisis because that's.
But we don't have the army. You know, if we're marching in the street, we wouldn't have an army behind us.
Well, you know, this raises a really important question of what does everybody else do at that moment, right? There's been a lot of talk of like the ICE, the immigration officials that are going around rounding people up and deporting people. What is their role in this? And I think in many ways you see historically the military have been, you know, resisting some of these calls. I don't think that the traditional military, of course, Pete Hegseth is in charge of the Defense Department, but I think the military would resist that, any kind of use of armed forces inside the United States against U.S. population. I think there would be he would not be able to carry that off, depending on how far he wanted to go with that.
Yeah, there were only 1,500 of them. It's barely a brigade. Mayor,
That's not in the U.S., where the military has been used against the people since Vietnam.
yeah, I mean,
The National Guard was
It was
in
the National Guard.
1960s,
in
but-
Detroit in the summer of 1967 was either the 82nd or the 101st. I think it was the 82nd was seconded along with the Michigan National Guard to end that riot.
And that didn't last.
And it was a very brief moment. I mean, that moment, and it may have even been units of the 82nd that were connected to the Michigan National Guard, that kind of thing. And then 55 years ago, last weekend, the 101st was on the roof, pointing at me as I was demonstrating after the Kent State massacre. But that was the only time, and they weren't at street level, but they had been brought into Washington.
And
were
now,
available. Now, I mean, who knows? I mean, I think this is wild speculation and going to the question of fear. I think that a lot of people, again, just a reading from too much time on social media, that a lot of people are just concerned not to give a hostage to fortune by demonstrating over the line, by going that much further than you're allowed to. And there haven't been confrontations with police on any of these marches, as opposed to, say, during the demonstrations after George Floyd's murder, where, you know, Portland became, and still is, from what one can tell, an armed camp with an organized group calling themselves an Antifa movement. I mean, they don't have leaders, but they make Portland a pretty difficult place to live. But other than that, that's about the only time. And so far, this has been very peaceful. Mary, do you, in the back there, thanks.
Thank you. I wanted to take issue slightly with one of the things that, one of the former themes, which was about the idea of an independent judiciary being a sort of guarantee of democracy. Because, you know, we're all speaking from countries where we sort of think we've got an independent judiciary, but I mean, in the US, the judiciary is not independent. It's incredibly political. It's voted on at local level, and it's appointed by the democratically elected president. That is not an an independent judiciary. Look at the UK. The appointment of judges in the UK is incredibly opaque. It's very difficult to see that as any sort of guarantee, any sort of independent judiciary. And yet, Brits and Americans sort of go around all over Eastern Europe, you know, the latest example being Ukraine, saying that an independent judiciary is really what they've got to introduce as the absolute key and guarantee of democracy. I'd just like you to react to that.
Go ahead.
I agree that in many democracies, the way in which the judiciary are appointed is open to question and is, as you say, particularly in this country, extremely opaque. But I think the record in established democracies tends to show that by and large, judges are prepared to say to governments, under the law, you cannot do this. I mean, we saw the great example here, of course, of the Supreme Court ruling against Boris Johnson proroguing Parliament over Brexit, which was an extraordinary example, I think, in this country of the highest judicial body saying to the executive, this goes beyond your legal powers.
You can argue that, in fact, the reverse, that this was overruling democratically elected Parliament.
It wasn't Parliament that was proposing its own prorogation. It was the executive. There are other examples, I mean, also in the US, where judges have ruled against the executive. And I think what one has to accept that there has to be some way of controlling an executive power, because it's in the very nature of power that whoever has it wants to hold on to it and to increase it. And in a democracy, there must be some way of holding that executive to account. And the legislature obviously is one way of doing it in our system, but there are other systems where you do go to the courts. I mean, I've spent some time working in Italy, where the judicial system is entirely politicized and very imperfect in that sense. But I still think it's an essential attribute of what we think of traditionally as a liberal democracy.
And I would say that, you know, Ukraine has a lot of the same problems, or had a lot of the same problems that Russia had, of rampant corruption of judges, that it was a crucial demand of, you know, U.S. military aid that they try to reform their judicial system. And, you know, the judicial system in the U.S. is obviously not perfect. I mean, federal judges are appointed by the president, but they have to be confirmed by the Senate, and that can often, as we know, you know, that can often weed out certain candidates. But, you know, you saw Biden push through a lot of appointees and took up time and you know, didn't push ahead with some ambassadors as a result to try to get some of these federal judges appointees through. So I don't know. I don't think it's fair to say that the U.S. shouldn't be lecturing Ukraine on its judicial system. I think it needs some work.
Mary is a very practiced devil's advocate, and she knows as well as we all do that it's a question of degree.
Yeah.
And what strikes me walking around London these days is I hear a lot of Turkish spoken, and occasionally I stop and talk to people because I lived in Turkey, and as you can tell, I'm very concerned about what's happening. And what strikes me is that these are young professionals who speak good English, who rode the wave of Erdogan's first 20 years when the economy was going gangbusters and new schools and roads and hospitals were being built. And Turkey took its rightful place, actually, as a major power, a place that it hadn't really had since the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. I mean, that's, in many ways, that's a kind of natural thing that was going to happen with or without Erdogan. But then you talk to them, and they're here because they're essentially political refugees. They haven't left because the state is after them. They've left because they don't want their kids to grow up in Turkey, and those who can afford to leave are, which is quite striking.
Okay. Down here, and then we'll go over there.
I just wanted to talk a bit more about the category of democratic autocrats and whether that's always fair, and saying people now are comfortably knowingly voting for authoritarian tickets when is that what they're voting for, or are they just voting for themselves? And we're talking about figures like Trump and Netanyahu as grouped together when they're massively different leaders, and I wonder whether Trump is democratically supported. He actually has the support of his electorate, and really he's a democratically elected figure, but some of his actions just project beyond what is democratic and project into authoritarian action. So is it necessarily fair grouping them together when Netanyahu doesn't really have the support of his electorate? And there was something you said earlier saying most Israelis don't know what's going on, they don't really know what Netanyahu's like. I mean Israelis do know what's going on, because, and we know that because we know they don't want the war that's going on. They don't want that, despite what the kind of Israelis that a Louis Theroux documentary shows us. Those are quite extremist. So there's kind of a twofold thing between grouping all these leaders together and necessarily saying that they're all voted for on their autocracy, which I think is just not true, and potentially also what cost the Democrats so much in the election recently.
I mean, Trump is an interesting example, isn't he? Because certainly by the time the 2024 election came around, people had no excuse for saying we didn't know this was what he was likely to do. They had very good reason to know exactly what kind of a leader Trump was and what kind of instincts he had. I mean, I think what we've been discussing is a phenomenon where people use their democratic right to choose freely a candidate of their choice in the knowledge that that candidate has authoritarian views and is likely to use the power that they're giving him or her in an authoritarian way. And there is an irony in that. I go back to that quote from Goebbels. I mean, democracies do contain within them the power, the right to give power to their enemies to destroy democracy. And I don't think we have worked out quite how to handle that. The Algerian example that you started with was an example of one attempt to do that.
Is what?
Sorry?
Speak up.
Just saying about like Goebbels being as an example of great function of democracy.
Yeah. Actually, Omar Bakri Mohammed said exactly the same thing to me about a year before the 7/7 attacks in London. And it's there. I mean, it's obvious. And the way you inoculate is to make democracy, the actions of democracy that people in society go through, like going to the ballot box, being reasonably well informed about what's happening in the world.
I mean, one of the things
Damn,
we
that's
haven't
annoying.
discussed is Trump's fantastic success in popularizing the view that everything you read or hear or see in the media is fake news, and therefore you don't need to believe anything. And so if people say you are behaving in an anti-democratic way or you are favoring your crony pals, it's all fake news. So if you tell them not to believe that, they end up not believing anything and become far more malleable and far more prone to your...
But in the Soviet Union, people did know. They actually knew, didn't they, in Russia?
What?
They didn't believe anything that Tass
Yeah,
was
they all
telling.
knew. Yeah,
They all knew what was
that,
going on
that it was.
because their uncle got dragged away at 3 a.m. to the gulag.
But I would also say that Trump is actually governing in a far more radical way than he campaigned on. Yes, he talked about tariffs, but no one thought he was going to go as far on tariffs as he did. I mean, that took everyone by surprise. And I think there was a level of disbelief that he would go full Project 2025, that perhaps he would institute part of it, but that he was not going to be sending Elon Musk into government agencies to dismantle them and take, control of computer systems.
I've been given the high sign from the back of the room, and this woman here I promised her a question.
Thank you very much. I have a two-folded question. And I think those are the points that maybe have been missed from the conversation. So I would very much appreciate the reflections from the panel members. First is the sort of more globalized sort of way of looking at where the democracy stands, right? And we know that for the first time, under the Freedom House Index, the number of countries that are sort of scored as autocracies has exceeded the number of those that are scored as democracies. And what that means in terms of sort of, even exporting the notion of democracy, right? So I come from a former Soviet Union country, and my generation in particular, because I lived through the breaking up of the Soviet Union as a child and grew up through the 90s and the revolutions and whatnot, we understand the notion of freedom, what it means to overcome your fears through the protests and, whatnot. But those notions are not the same now. Those democratic values are not the same. Say, in the 90s, the Central Asian countries would be welcomed through the, into the clubs, right? Because there was something in them that they could show off. These days, it does not matter for them. You go to Tajikistan or Kyrgyzstan these days, they don't care what the OSCE even has to say to them, right? So that would be super useful. And the second point would be the Gen Z. And Gen Z is very important, right? And it's a term that many people use, but we know from the German elections, for example, and the French elections that the younger population, they do not prefer the democracy in the way that traditional classical democracy notion would be taught in schools and universities, etc. So thank you very much.
Okay. Why don't we take that thought, thank you, and just have a quick round the horn with some summary of how parlous is the condition of the democracy that we four grew up with, the idea of democracy, the way of behaving, acting in a democracy.
I'd like to think in some places the problems are temporary and in others they're more serious. So the country I've talked about today, Turkey, I think it is really serious. And as I said, I think when the body politic gets changed fundamentally, it's very hard to change it back. And I think, as other panelists have made the point, that autocrats don't arise in vacuums. They arise because of the failure of what preceded them. And certainly in Turkey, the governments of the 1990s that I covered, I mean, I could name you prime ministers that you've never heard of. Their governments were not very effective. They weren't successful. Erdogan is a massively successful politician. He's the longest serving leader since Ataturk. And I think his ambition is to be buried in a mausoleum even bigger than Ataturk's, on a hill overlooking the Bosphorus in Istanbul. And yes, the Turks allowed that to happen. They allowed that to happen. And, they voted for him repeatedly. And they're now living with the consequences.
Robert?
Those of us who are lucky enough to have grown up in a democracy are all sort of children of the Reformation. I mean, we've grown up in a political system which is based on the notions of universal human rights, the freedom to say what you believe, the freedom of assembly, the freedom to live the life that you wish to lead, and to vote for the people you wish to vote for. That, to me, is the cardinal essence of what democracy means. What we've seen over the last few decades is that for some people that doesn't deliver, and therefore they turn to alternatives. And what we've been talking about is some of the alternatives that they have turned to, freely of their own volition. And I think the question that none of us really knows the answer to is whether that's a temporary move or whether it marks the end of a, 200-year progression from the French Revolution, the American Revolution, up until, well, the present day, I suppose. 2016 seems to have been a very useful cut-off point. Brexit and Trump won. And we don't know whether that's a permanent thing or a temporary thing.
Stephanie?
Yeah, picking up on what she said, I think one of the things we haven't talked about enough is, I think it's not a coincidence that the rise of authoritarian governments more or less tracks the rise of social media and the impact of social media on voters and the way they get their information. And the decline of traditional journalism, whereby you have professionally trained journalists going out, fact-checking, reporting, trying to talk to both sides, and a sense that voters are relying on a shared sense of the truth. And we don't have a shared sense of the truth anymore. And that's particularly the case for younger generation that don't consume traditional news and are getting their, information from Instagram or TikTok. And I think that it's hard to measure. And I think that's one of the reasons why no one's really able to talk about it. But it's one of the reasons why the Russian intelligence is making such a huge push to try to manipulate people's feeds on social media. So I think that's the thing that concerns me the most, and because I think it's the hardest thing to fix, actually, and means we're gonna be facing some rough years ahead.
Well, that's optimistic. go back and forth a lot, and I think that if I have one thing to wind up by saying is the democracy, autocracy argument in America is everyone should look beyond Trump and look at the social infrastructure is the wrong word, but there's well-tilled soil now with roots that go deep. Trump is just the first mushroom that's popped up through the shitty soil. And it's worth looking, because I still do think that if democracy revives in America, then democracy revives elsewhere. Although now that we have an American Pope, it could be, as I was saying to Robin beforehand, they never had an American Pope. Why? Because the cardinals in conclave thought, America has all the power. We can't also give them the papacy. So they just gave America the papacy. So maybe the cardinals think, gee, America's declining in power. We got to cut them a break somehow. We'll see what happens. I want to thank very much Jonathan Rugman, Robin Lustig, and Stephanie Baker. It's been